What's going on, guys? It's NYPrepper here. In this video, I want to discuss a major threat to preppers after a collapse of society or SHTF scenario. And this threat is highly overlooked by many preppers. So that's why I want to do an entire video on it and bring attention to it. So this way you guys can protect yourself from this threat. And what this threat is are booby traps, okay? Now, most preppers don't think about the threat posed by booby traps because we often think about more sexy threats like getting into a gunfight with marauders or prying rooms in our house. However, you will also have to face the silent killer that will be hiding and waiting for you anywhere you go, and that's booby traps. So in this video, I'm going to go over the different types of booby traps that I think you're going to encounter after a collapse of society, and I'm also going to discuss how to protect yourself from them. So after a collapse of society, I believe there will be booby traps and IEDs all over the United States, and the country will become a lot like a war-torn country filled with undetonated mines like Southeast Asia or the Balkans. I think that after society collapses, people and preppers are going to be putting up booby traps all over the place, okay? And not just preppers and, good-willed citizens, but even bad guys will be using booby traps to capture people and trap people, all right? So I think that America and most countries in the world, after a major collapse of society, I believe that there would be booby traps all over the place, and it would be extremely dangerous to travel in certain locations if you're not aware of them and how to protect yourself from them, okay? So you could potentially fall victim to booby traps if you're not careful when you are, let's say, conducting recon missions, if you're entering structures, if you're patrolling, if you're bugging out, if you're scavenging resources, or if you're moving from point A to point B for whatever reason. Now, there are two basic types of booby traps to watch out for, and those are offensive and defensive booby traps. So a defensive booby trap would be set up by people for security purposes, most likely around their homes or properties, and you could potentially step on one or trigger one. Luckily, defensive booby traps will be the most easily avoided as long as you keep a healthy distance from homes, cabins, bug-out locations, farms, or any residential structures and associated property. It is likely that the traps would be placed inside of the residential structures by the people living there for defensive purposes, especially in windows, doorways, main entrances, and any kind of supply caches or storage closets where important supplies are. And those booby traps would most definitely be on the first floor. So if you're entering a structure on the first floor, and even if you think it's abandoned, there could be booby traps in the windows, in the doors, all over the place, okay? Also, they will likely be placed around the property, and some traps may even be placed further back away from the structures, especially in more rural locations where property owners may feel like they're not as worried about someone accidentally being harmed by their traps, all right? So defensive booby traps are one of the main threats of booby traps you have to think about, and that's mostly just going to be law-abiding citizens and preppers and people just trying to protect their homes. They're going to be setting up booby traps. And even in areas where entire neighborhoods are abandoned, the booby traps are going to be left behind on these people's properties, on their yards, inside of their homes. And if you're not careful and you're walking through this area for whatever reason, you could potentially step on one or trigger one and harm yourself really badly. So you have to watch out for defensive booby traps. And the second type of booby trap that is potentially more dangerous and more difficult to detect are the offensive booby traps. Offensive booby traps would likely be used by marauders, cannibals, rapists, thieves, human traffickers, and any kind of desperate, hungry person that's just looking to take your supplies from you. So all those people will be setting up traps to either catch people or wound them, and once they're wounded, they can track you down by your blood trail. These will be more difficult to detect and avoid, but there are some simple things you can do to protect yourself, and I'll show you how. Before I get into how to protect yourself, I want to share some examples of common defensive and offensive booby traps that you will likely encounter after a collapse of society. So I'm going to start with the most common and simple traps that I think are going to be very widespread and pretty much everywhere after a collapse of society. And then I'm going to move into the more complicated or more difficult to protect yourself from type of traps, okay? So the most simple common traps that I think you're going to run into are nail boards. Nail boards are just, let's say, 2x4s or pieces of plywood with nails or screws put through them, so the nails and the screws pop out of one side. And these could be scattered around people's property lines, around people's homes. These would be highly likely around people's homes, as it is a quick type of booby trap that pretty much anyone can make in their garage very quickly. All right, everybody has nails, everybody has a hammer, and everybody has wood. So I think these nail boards are going to be, very common. I think people are going to put them around their yards. They're going to put them inside of their homes. They're going to rig up some kind of different types of traps. All right, so nail boards you have to watch out for, and the nail boards can be concealed with leaf litter, so you can take leaves and throw the leaves on top of the nail board, and you wouldn't even know if you're moving through an area. You could step on one and you wouldn't even see it because it's camouflaged by the leaves. Offensive nail boards, if they're used offensively, could be rusty or have feces put on them that would cause infection, which would slow you down and allow the bad guys to catch you, okay? They can also be used to flatten tires as well. Another one are caltrops. Caltrops are four-sided nails that are made by bending nails and welding them together. And they would be used the same way as nail boards, and they can also be used to flatten tires. Another one is punji stakes. Punji stakes were used widely by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, and they're just sharpened wooden stakes placed upright in a small depression or pit, and they're covered up by leaves or some type of organic matter to conceal the pit, and an unsuspecting soldier would step on them and step into the pit not knowing that they're there, and the punji stake would puncture their foot. And the punji stakes had feces on them that the Viet Cong would put on there. And what happened was, even though it wasn't a mortal wound because it was just a foot wound, but stepping on one of those stakes with the feces, it would cause an infection, and that would put the soldier out of the battle. He couldn't, ruck anymore. He couldn't fight because his foot was wounded badly. And because of the feces, he would have to be taken out of the battle and given antibiotics. All right, so punji stakes are very easy to make, and I believe a lot of people will be, setting up punji stakes. All you have to do is just sharpen sticks, and if it's an offensive punji stake, they would likely put feces on them. Moving on from punji stakes, we have nooses. Okay, nooses are less likely, but still possible. A noose for a man or a human being would be hard to conceal because it would have to be huge, but it could potentially be done if enough care is taken to conceal it. You could also run into leg hold traps, which are basically the same as a noose, but it catches your leg, kind of like an animal trap. And the most likely use of a leg hold trap would be offensively by human traffickers, rapists, or some type of psychopaths. The next one is deadfalls. Deadfalls are concealed pits with stakes in them, and they're covered up by a layer of branches and brush. The deadfall could be many feet deep. It could be, let's say, 5 or 6 feet deep, and there's stakes on the bottom of it, and it's covered up by branches and leaves. So when you're walking, you'll walk right through those thin layer of branches and leaves, and you'll fall down into the pit and land on top of the spikes and get impaled. The final simple trap is, just basic bear traps or beaver traps, animal traps. They could be placed in forested environments and covered up with leaves, especially on hiking trails and paths of least resistance. So they could adapt animal traps, especially beaver traps and bear traps, to be used against human beings. So the more complex type of traps that are more difficult to protect yourself from and that are going to be less likely are going to be some type of IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. And it's really hard to say what type of IEDs there will be after SHTF, because there's so many different types of materials out there, and there's people with different knowledge, and so people are going to be concocting different types of IEDs. So it's hard to say specifically what type of IED, but the typical ones to look out for would be some type of tripwire system, where you have a tripwire that's connected to some type of firing pin device with ammunition inside of it. So when you trip the wire, it triggers a firing pin that would detonate something. It could be ammunition, or it could set off a pipe bomb or some type of improvised bomb. Pipe bombs are something that you have to definitely look out for, but tripwires and pipe bombs, all right, those are going to be big ones. And it's relatively easy to make IEDs from basic components that are readily available, like gunpowder, fertilizer, magnesium, gasoline, propane, and many other chemicals that I can't get into for legal reasons. Now, moving on from IEDs, you can also run into improvised traps. And the best way to describe this is if you've ever seen the movie Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, in the movie Predator, there's this alien creature that's trying to hunt down and kill Arnold Schwarzenegger and his group of special forces. And once they're in a bad situation, and when Arnold Schwarzenegger realizes that they can't see the Predator and they can't fight it, Arnold Schwarzenegger decides to make a bunch of traps at the end of the movie in order to try to trap the Predator, because he realized that the Predator could see their weapons and use their heat against them. So he realized that if he made some type of traps, the Predator might not see the traps, and they could trap the Predator. So Arnold Schwarzenegger makes a very complicated system of traps using ropes and different things and stakes and things like that. So if you haven't seen Predator, you got to watch it, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. But there's a lot of different types of improvised traps that you can make. I'm not going to really get too much into it, because for legal reasons, I'm not going to be teaching people how to make deadly traps that could be used against human beings. But there are ways to do it, and it's not that hard to do, okay? And a lot of them could either be from textbooks, and others could just be improvised completely. So how do you avoid booby traps, and how do you protect yourself from them? So you've already taken a big step toward protecting yourself from booby traps just by watching this video, because now you're aware of the threat. Most people, including hardened preppers and survivalists, may not even be aware of booby traps as being a threat, or they may downplay it. So that's a huge step. Just being aware that the traps are out there is a huge step that you just took in protecting yourself. But the number one most important concept with booby traps is that you have to understand the basic principles behind any type of trap, whether it's a booby trap, an animal trap. There's two very important things that every trap has to have in order for it to work, okay? Whether it's a fur trapper or a terrorist, they both of them use the same principles, and that's number one, they're placed on choke points, paths of least resistance, and likely avenues of approach. So for example, if you're an animal trapper, you set up traps on game trails because that's where you expect the animals to be walking on. And if you're a predatory human, you would set up traps on human game trails like highways, hiking trails, choke points, likely avenues of approach, and any path of least resistance. Now, the second most critical concept to booby traps is there has to be some type of a bait or some type of a lure that brings the prey towards the trap. Now, in the case of animal traps, bait is commonly used. Like if you're setting up mouse traps, for example, you put some peanut butter or some kind of scent to lure the animal towards the trap, and you also put that mouse trap in an area where you know the mouses are hanging out, right? And it's the same thing with booby traps, okay? Booby traps are the same thing. They have to be put in a place where people are likely going to be, and there has to be some type of a bait for the person to walk into the trap, all right? Now, if you're, let's say, a prepper, if you run into a random survival cache in the woods, or you hear a child calling out for help, those could potentially be ways to bait you into a trap, okay? Also, a nice open cleared area in a densely forested environment could also funnel you towards a trap, okay? If it's a very dense, brushy area, and you're naturally going to want to follow a path of least resistance because moving through brushy areas is difficult. So if you see like an open area inside of an area of very dense brush, you're going to want to go to that open area naturally because it's easier for you. So that's likely where somebody could potentially put a trap to try to trap you. All right, so those are the two important principles that you need to understand, okay? That traps are always going to be put in areas where the prey are going to be, and there's always going to be some type of a bait, okay? So you want to avoid choke points, paths of least resistance, and likely avenues of approach, and you don't want to take any kind of bait. So you want to avoid paths of least resistance, likely avenues of approach, and choke points if possible. And you want to avoid being baited or taking the bait, whether it's a random pile of ammo or supplies, a prepper's storage pantry, or maybe a child pretending to be injured. Those are all common types of bait. Be wary of entering structures, as there could be booby traps at every doorway or window. Be careful of crossing through open areas. Be careful when moving through steep valleys or gorges or any terrain that funnels your movements. In an urban area, this could be an alleyway, a tunnel, or a bridge. Be careful when walking through cleared out areas or trails within brushy terrain, as the path of least resistance will entice you to a trap. You're better off moving through dense brushy area that is difficult to move through, as the booby trapper will be less likely to set up a trap over there. Be careful when traveling on roadways, hiking trails, and any other paths of least resistance, because that is where people will naturally want to go, and thus that's where the traps will likely be. Also, likely avenues of approach will also be booby trapped. Avoid traveling or entering structures on likely avenues of approach. You never want to enter a structure on the first floor through the front door, for example, okay? The next thing that you can do, besides just avoiding the paths of least resistance, the avenues of approach, the choke points, and being aware of bait, is you want to also get some puncture-resistant insoles. And I recently did a video on puncture-resistant insoles, and I'll attach that video at the top of your screen so you can go and watch it. But a puncture-resistant insole is just a special type of insole for your boots that has a steel sheet underneath it. So if you step on anything like a nail board or a punji stake, you're not going to penetrate your foot, okay, because the steel on the insole will block that sharp object from puncturing through your boot and into your foot, okay. Another thing too is you want to be aware of your surroundings at all times. Obviously, you know, that goes without saying, but you specifically want to look for anything that's unusual or out of the ordinary. And if something doesn't look right, you should never ignore your instincts. You should always slow down or stop completely and use your senses to look, listen, and smell, all right? Because chances are you may be detecting a possible booby trap. So be aware of your surroundings and don't ignore your instincts. Look for things out of the ordinary. The other thing you can do is put yourself in the mind of a booby trapper, whether it's an offensive booby trapper or a defensive booby trapper. As you're moving through different areas, try to think like a booby trapper and where you would set up traps if you were trying to trap somebody, okay? Now, the next thing to do is avoid ransacking caches that are left out in unusual spots, or anything that could seem like it would be bait, okay? So if you're walking through the forest and you see a pile of ammunition in the middle of nowhere, you know, that's a little bit strange. And especially if it's like in an open area, you have to consider the possibility that it could be booby trapped. The next thing you want to do is avoid traveling close to homes and residential structures. Give them a wide berth, even if they're abandoned, because the owner could be long gone, but the traps are probably still there. And, you know, you definitely want to be aware of, you know, the possibility that there could be traps placed inside of caches or supply storage areas inside of these residential structures. And finally, you want to be extremely careful if you're raiding an abandoned stash, cache, or supply storage area. They will likely be booby trapped by the former owner, even if they're long gone or dead, okay? So be extremely careful if you come across an abandoned prepper storage supply area. Be extremely careful, or any storage supply area, whether it's a prepper's house or someone else's house. People are going to be booby trapping their stashes, okay? So be extremely careful. So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, let me know. And as always, take care, God bless, and don't forget the 3 Ps: prepare, practice, and persevere.